Welcome to the World Rapid Final. We've got a heavyweight clash as Veselin Topalov with the white pieces takes on Teimour Radjabov. Let's dive in. Topalov opens with the pawn to d4, and Radjabov answers with a classic King's Indian defense setup. Both sides develop quickly, staking their claims in the center of the board. Standard development continues. The knights come out, the bishops find their posts, and both kings are quickly castled to safety. Black challenges the center with a pawn trade on d4, and the middle game begins. White builds a solid pawn wall with f3, while black starts probing on the king side, sending a knight towards h5. White kicks it back, and now black pushes the h-pawn forward, looking for action. The pieces continue to dance around the board. Topalov centralizes his queen and rooks, controlling key files, while Radjabov maneuvers his knight into a fantastic outpost on e5. The tension is building. White tucks the knight back to c2, preparing to challenge black's control of the center. In response, black develops the bishop to e6, shoring up the position. White brings the knight to a3, a natural-looking move, but it eases the pressure just a bit. A slightly more precise idea was this: pawn to b3, stopping black's queenside ideas. After rook to d8, the rook swings to g2. Bishop to c8 and bishop to e3 keeps white firmly in control. A few quiet moves follow. Black's rook slides to d8, white's queen repositions to e1, and black prepares future queenside expansion with pawn to a6. Topalov swings his queen over to g3, eyeing the kingside, but this gives black a real opportunity. The engine preferred keeping the queenside locked down. Pawn to a4 was best. After pawn to f6, the pawns are exchanged, the queen recaptures, and only now queen to g3 is strong. But Radjabov misses his chance. He drops the bishop back to c8, and the advantage slips away. The key idea was to strike immediately on the queenside. Pawn to b5 was the move. After pawn to c5, bishop to c8, and after the trade on d6, the rook recaptures and black is better. And now white plays pawn to h4. Another slight inaccuracy in a complex position, once again giving black a chance. The best plan was still to secure the queenside. Pawn to a4 was the move. Knight to f8, knight to c2, bishop to e6, and knight to e3 holds everything together. And there it is. Radjabov finally pushes the pawn to b5, breaking open the queenside. Topalov has no choice but to capture it, and black's recapture with the pawn on b5 is an excellent move. This is the only way to keep a clear advantage, creating serious threats on the a-file. The position is incredibly sharp. White plays pawn to a3, and black's knights begin a dizzying dance, jumping to f8, then e6, and finally to a monster square on c5, putting immense pressure on white. Topalov tries to break the bind with pawn to b4, kicking the knight away. The pieces reposition, and with black's queen on a7, white launches a kingside counterattack with pawn to f4. And here, Radjabov decides to cash in, as the knight takes the pawn on a3. But this trade actually releases most of the pressure. And the stronger continuation was to keep the tension. Knight to b2 was the killer move. Rook to b1, pawn to d5, and after the central pawns are exchanged, black's position is overwhelming. A fantastic reply from Topalov. Knight takes knight on a3 is the only move. He correctly eliminates the dangerous intruder and gets ready to unleash his own attack. Black's queen recaptures on a3, and Topalov wastes no time, immediately ramming the pawn forward to f5. The kingside battle is on. Radjabov brings his bishop out to c4, a move that looks active but is a defensive error. He needed to be more careful. The bishop should have retreated to c8. Then, after pawn to f6, bishop to f8 prepares to defend. If white sacrifices on h5, black simply takes it and wins material. Wow, Topalov unleashes a brilliant sacrifice. The bishop takes the pawn on h5, a stunning move to rip open the defenses around the black king. Radjabov has to accept the gift. The pawn takes the bishop on h5, but now his king is completely exposed, and Topalov follows through. The pawn pushes to f6, tearing another hole in the kingside. Black's defense is on the ropes, and this is a critical moment. He had one very tough way to hold on, but he misses it. The best defense was rook to e6. After pawn takes bishop on g7, knight to c1, pawn to g6, and the rook takes the pawn on g6, keeping the game alive. But in the game, Radjabov plays bishop to h8, and this allows white's attack to become decisive. And here comes the next wave. White pushes the pawn to g6, and black's position is cracking apart. An incredible find from Radjabov. Bishop takes pawn on f6 is the only move to stay in the game, eliminating a key attacker. Here's how black survives. After queen to f3, the king steps to g7. White grabs the pawn on h5, and the king runs to f8, escaping the immediate danger. Topalov plays the knight to d5. a tricky move, but it's an inaccuracy that lets black back into the game. He had a much stronger path. Queen to f3 was crushing. King to g7, queen takes pawn on h5, king to f8, and now pawn takes pawn on f7 wins material and the game. And now a huge moment. Radjabov can save the game with the right recapture, but he has to be precise. The correct way was pawn takes knight on d5. After pawn takes on f7 with check, the king takes back, queen to g6 check, and king to e6. And incredibly, black is actually winning a piece. Instead of that, he plays bishop takes knight on d5, and this is a mistake that gives the advantage right back to white. White simply recaptures as the pawn takes the bishop on d5, and Topalov is back in the driver's seat. And here comes the final, fatal mistake of the game. Black's position is difficult, but there was still a way to defend. The only chance was rook to b8. After the pawn check on f7, the king takes, queen to g6 check, and king to e7 holds the position together for now. But in the game, Radjabov plays queen to b2, and this is a game-losing blunder. Topalov now has a forced win, and Topalov finds it. The pawn takes the pawn on f7 with check, the first move of a beautiful winning combination. The black king is forced to f8, but this just walks into the next part of the tactic. A slightly tougher defense was king to h8. After queen to g6, bishop to g5, queen takes pawn on h5 check, and king to g7, though white is still winning. Another fantastic move. Queen to g8 check is perfectly calculated, forcing the king exactly where white wants it. The king is dragged out to e7, and now it's all over. White has a devastating follow-up. Topalov has a completely winning position. Incredibly, there was an even more crushing move here. The absolute best was pawn takes rook on e8, promoting to a rook with check. After rook takes rook, queen to e6 check, king to d8, and queen takes pawn on d6 wins a full rook. But the move played in the game is pawn to f8, promoting to a queen with check. It might not be the engine's top choice, but it is completely winning and forces an immediate resignation, and Radjabov resigns. A thrilling back-and-forth battle decided by a brilliant sacrifice from Topalov, and a final tragic blunder. White wins as black is down a rook with no counterplay.